Henry Carter stood in front of room 1809 at the luxurious Riverside Grand Hotel, rain drumming against the hallway windows behind him. In his hands, a bouquet of red roses, an emergency late-night delivery that had pulled him from his daughter's bedside story. When the door swung open, the woman inside wasn't the one he was supposed to meet. She was Astrid Wellington, a billionaire standing alone in the middle of an empty suite, wearing an expensive silk robe, her eyes carrying a weariness that money couldn't touch. One small mistake, one wrong room number, was about to pull a struggling single father into the life of the city's wealthiest woman and change both of their destinies forever. Henry had been delivering flowers for almost 3 years now, ever since the accident that took his wife. The night shift paid better, and better meant everything when you were raising a 6-year-old daughter on your own. Bonnie was his entire world, a bright-eyed little girl with her mother's smile and a laugh that could make the worst day bearable. She was asleep now, safe with Mrs. Chen from downstairs, the neighbor who watched her whenever Henry had to take these late calls. He worked the jobs nobody else wanted, the midnight anniversary surprises, the apology bouquets delivered at 2 in the morning, the desperate romantic gestures that couldn't wait until sunrise. Tonight's order had been simple enough. Room 1819. Red roses. No card, just cash left at the front desk. But somehow, somewhere between the lobby and the 18th floor, Henry's tired eyes had read the numbers wrong. Astrid Wellington owned 17 five-star hotels across the country. She'd built her empire from the ground up, turning her family's failing real estate business into a billion-dollar portfolio before she turned 30. She was 34 now, and she'd never been married. Never even come close. She'd learned early that people wanted her money, her connections, her influence. Never just her. The last man she'd trusted had sold their private conversations to a tabloid, published text messages where she'd been vulnerable, where she'd admitted to feeling lonely despite everything she'd accomplished. That had been 2 years ago. She hadn't let anyone close since then. Tonight, she was hiding in one of her own hotels, trying to avoid the anniversary of her father's death. The suite felt too big, too quiet, too much like her life had become. When she opened the door and saw the man standing there with roses, her first thought was that Marcus had sent them. Her ex, trying to worm his way back into her life with some grand gesture. But the confusion on the delivery man's face told her otherwise. He was looking down at his phone, then at the door number, then back at his phone. He looked exhausted, his jacket soaked from the rain, his hair dripping. There was something about his expression, a kind of honest bewilderment, that made her pause instead of simply closing the door. Henry's stomach dropped when he realized his mistake. This wasn't room 1819. This was 1809. And the woman standing in front of him, backlit by the soft glow of the suite behind her, was someone he recognized from magazine covers and news articles, though he'd never paid much attention to the business world. He started to apologize, backing away, but Astrid surprised them both by speaking first. The rain had picked up, hammering against the windows at the end of the hall, and she could see him shivering slightly. She heard herself say something she hadn't planned. She invited him in. The gesture was so unexpected that Henry hesitated. He explained about the mix-up, about the right room being 10 floors up, about needing to get going. But there was something in her eyes, a kind of loneliness he recognized because he saw it in his own mirror every morning. And the rain really was coming down hard. He stepped inside, just for a moment, just until the worst of the storm passed. He kept the flowers in his hands, unsure what else to do with them. They stood awkwardly in the entryway of the enormous suite. Astrid offered him a towel, which he accepted gratefully. She asked if he wanted coffee. He said yes, even though he probably shouldn't. As she moved to the kitchenette, Henry noticed how empty the place felt despite its luxury. There were no personal items anywhere. No photos, no books, nothing that suggested someone actually lived here. It was beautiful and hollow, like a museum display. When Astrid came back with 2 cups of coffee, they sat at opposite ends of the long sofa, maintaining a careful distance. She asked him about his work. He told her about the flower shop, about the night shifts, about how sometimes people's most important moments happened when the rest of the world was sleeping. She found herself genuinely interested. He spoke with a quiet warmth, never complaining about the late hours or the difficult customers. He mentioned his daughter once, just in passing, his whole face changing when he said her name. Bonnie died 6 years old. Loved dinosaurs and thought flowers were magic. For the first time in longer than Astrid could remember, she laughed. Really laughed. Not the polite sound she made at business dinners or charity galas, but something real. Henry smiled at the sound, and they talked a little longer, about nothing important and everything important at the same time. Eventually, the rain softened to a drizzle. Henry stood up, thanking her for the coffee and the dry towel. He still had to deliver those roses to the right room. As he reached the door, Astrid did something she couldn't quite explain. She asked if he'd like to get coffee sometime. Actual coffee, not the instant kind from a hotel kitchenette. Henry looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. He glanced around the suite again, at the view of the city through floor-to-ceiling windows, at the marble countertops and designer furniture. Then he looked down at his worn jacket and cheap shoes. He thanked her politely and said he didn't think that was a good idea. The door closed softly behind him, and Astrid stood alone in the silence, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Rejection. But also, strangely, respect. Henry delivered the roses to room 1819. "Are you?" A man in a business suit answered, looking nervous and grateful. Somewhere inside the room, a woman's voice called out, asking who it was. Henry left quickly, not wanting to intrude on whatever reunion or apology was happening. As he rode the elevator down to the lobby, he thought about the woman in 1809. She'd been kind. Surprisingly normal, considering who she was. But he knew better than to cross those kinds of lines. He had Bonnie to think about. The last thing he needed was to get tangled up with someone from a completely different world. Someone who could never understand what his life was actually like. What Henry didn't know was that someone had seen him leaving Astrid's floor. A photographer, hired by a gossip website to stake out the hotel after a tip about a celebrity staying there, had been in the lobby when Henry came down. The man didn't recognize Henry, but he recognized opportunity. He'd gotten photos of Henry entering the hotel with flowers, and he'd watched which floor the elevator stopped at. It didn't take much research to find out who owned the penthouse suite on 18. By morning, the story was everywhere. Local flower delivery man spotted leaving billionaire Astrid Wellington's hotel suite after midnight. The photos were grainy but unmistakable. Henry's face. Astrid's hotel. The flowers in his hands. The internet did what the internet does best. It filled in the blanks with speculation, rumor, and scandal. Henry's boss called him at 7 in the morning, waking him and Bonnie both. The man's voice was tight with anger. Customers were already calling, asking if the shop had been selling stories to the press. The owner didn't care about the truth. He cared about his business reputation. Henry was fired, effective immediately. "Don't bother coming in to get your last paycheck. We'll mail it." The line went dead. Henry sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone, trying to process what had just happened. Bonnie appeared in his doorway, clutching her stuffed dinosaur, asking if everything was okay. He forced a smile and told her everything was fine. Astrid saw the stories before her first meeting of the day. Her assistant brought them to her attention, concerned about the potential PR fallout. Astrid read through the articles, her jaw tightening with each invented detail. They were calling it a secret affair. They were speculating about how long they'd been seeing each other. They were dragging Henry's name through the mud, calling him a gold digger, an opportunist. She knew none of it was true. She also knew that her board of directors would see this as exactly the kind of scandal they'd been warning her about. For years, they'd been pushing her to settle down, to present a more stable public image. A married CEO looked better to investors, they said. More trustworthy. She'd always refused, insisting her personal life was her own business. Now they had ammunition to pressure her even more. The emergency board meeting was called for that afternoon. Astrid sat at the head of the long table, facing 9 men in expensive suits who'd made their positions very clear. This kind of publicity was unacceptable. If she was going to pursue relationships, they needed to be with appropriate partners. Suitable matches. People from their world who understood how these things worked. The fact that she was allegedly involved with some nobody delivery driver made the company look unstable. It made her look unstable. One of them suggested, not for the first time, that perhaps it was time for Astrid to step back from day-to-day operations. Let someone else take the reins. Someone more focused on the business and less on personal distractions. Astrid felt her hands curl into fists beneath the table. She wanted to tell them all exactly what they could do with their suggestions. Instead, she said nothing. She let them finish, thanked them for their time, and left the room with her head high and her heart pounding with fury. Henry tried calling the shop back, tried explaining what had really happened, but his former boss wouldn't take his calls. He started looking for new work immediately, but every interview ended the same way. Potential employers would Google his name, see the articles, and suddenly decide they didn't have any openings after all. Nobody wanted to hire someone attached to a scandal, even a fake one. By the end of the week, Henry had gone through his small savings paying rent and buying groceries. Bonnie asked why he was home so much now. He told her he was between jobs, trying a new schedule. She seemed to accept this, but he could see the worry in her eyes. Kids always knew when something was wrong, even when you tried to hide it. Henry made a decision. He would cut off all contact with Astrid Wellington. He'd never actually had contact with her beyond that one night, but he deleted her number from his phone anyway. The last thing he needed was for more photos to surface, more stories to spread. He had to protect Bonnie. That was all that mattered. If staying away from Astrid kept his daughter safe from this kind of attention, then that's what he'd do. He tried not to think about the coffee she'd offered, or the way she'd laughed, or the loneliness in her eyes that had mirrored his own. Astrid, meanwhile, found herself thinking about Henry more than she wanted to admit. She'd tried to reach out once, sending a message through the hotel's contact system asking if he was all right, if the news stories had caused him problems. The message bounced back. Number disconnected. She understood what that meant. He was cutting ties, putting distance between them. She couldn't blame him. Her world had a way of destroying anything good that came near it. Still, it stung. For the first time in years, she'd felt a genuine connection with someone, and it had lasted all of one conversation before reality crashed down on both of them. She sat in her penthouse apartment that night, looking out at the city lights, feeling the weight of her empty home pressing in on her. All the money in the world couldn't buy what she actually wanted. Someone who saw her. Someone who stayed. Henry spent his evenings applying for jobs online after Bonnie went to sleep. During the day, he helped her with schoolwork, made her meals, tried to keep everything feeling normal. But the stress was eating him alive. One night, Bonnie came into the kitchen while he was staring at yet another rejection email. She climbed into his lap without asking, wrapping her small arms around his neck. She asked if he was sad. He told her he was just tired. She said she missed when he smiled more. The simple honesty of it broke something in him. He held her tight, promising he'd try harder, promising everything would be okay, even though he wasn't sure how he'd make that true. Astrid couldn't focus on work. Her assistant noticed. Her board noticed. She'd always been ruthlessly efficient, closing deals and managing crises with calm precision. Now she was distracted, signing off on proposals without really reading them, cutting meetings short, spending hours staring out her office window. She kept thinking about that night. About Henry's kind eyes and the way he'd spoken about his daughter. About how he'd turned down her invitation because he'd known instantly that their worlds didn't match. She respected that. But it also made her realize how tired she was of her own world. The business dinners with fake smiles. The charity galas where people only wanted photos with her. The endless cycle of acquisition and expansion that never actually made her happy. She'd built an empire, but she'd forgotten to build a life. 3 weeks after the scandal broke, Astrid made a decision. She got in her car, dressed in jeans and a sweater instead of her usual designer suits, and drove to the neighborhood where Henry lived. She'd gotten the address from the flower shop's employee records, something she probably shouldn't have had access to, but did because she owned half the city's commercial properties. The neighborhood was old, the kind of place where buildings leaned against each other and laundry hung from fire escapes. She parked on the street and sat in her car for 10 minutes, questioning what she was doing. Then she got out and climbed the steps to his building. Henry answered his apartment door and froze when he saw her. Astrid stood in the dingy hallway, looking completely out of place and somehow more real than she had in her hotel suite. She started to apologize for showing up unannounced, but before she could finish, a small voice called from inside the apartment. Bonnie appeared behind Henry's legs, peering around at the stranger with curious eyes. She had paint on her hands and a smudge of blue across her cheek. She asked if the lady was a friend of her dad's. Henry didn't know what to say. Astrid knelt down so she was eye level with the little girl. She introduced herself. Just Astrid. Not Ms. Wellington or the CEO. Just Astrid. Bonnie liked her immediately, in the way that kids sometimes do with people who are genuinely kind. She grabbed Astrid's hand and pulled her inside, chattering about the picture she was painting. Henry watched, stunned, as his daughter led a billionaire into their cramped apartment. Bonnie showed Astrid her artwork, a family picture with stick figures. There was a big one labeled Daddy, and a small one labeled Me. There was also a third figure, taller than Henry, with a crown drawn on its head. Bonnie explained that was Mommy in heaven, watching over them. Astrid felt her throat tighten. She told Bonnie it was beautiful. The little girl beamed and then, without warning, told Astrid she should be in the picture too. She grabbed a red crayon and started drawing another figure, this one next to the daddy stick figure. Henry tried to stop her, embarrassed, but Astrid just smiled. She said she was honored to be in Bonnie's picture. They ended up sitting on the floor of Henry's living room, while Bonnie continued her artwork. Henry made coffee, the cheap instant kind, and brought it over. They talked in low voices while Bonnie hummed to herself and colored. Astrid explained why she'd come. She wanted to apologize. For the scandal. For the trouble it had caused him. Henry told her it wasn't her fault. She said she wanted to help, that she could make calls, get him a job at one of her hotels. He refused immediately. He appreciated the offer, but he couldn't accept charity. She insisted it wouldn't be charity, that he'd earn his position. He just shook his head. He had his pride, and right now, that was one of the few things he had left. Astrid understood. She respected it, even though it frustrated her. They sat in silence for a moment, and then she asked him the real question. Why had he cut contact? Why had he deleted her number? Henry looked at his daughter, who was now adding flowers to her drawing. He said he was protecting her, that his world and Astrid's didn't mix, and trying to force them together would only hurt Bonnie. Astrid asked, what if he was wrong? What if they could find a way to make it work? Henry met her eyes and admitted something he hadn't wanted to say out loud. He was afraid. Afraid of her world. Afraid of not being enough. Astrid reached across the space between them and took his hand. She told him she was afraid too. Afraid of a world without him in it. Bonnie finished her picture and proudly presented it to both of them. 4 stick figures now. Mommy in heaven. Daddy. Me. And Astrid, drawn with special care and labeled friend. The little girl asked if Astrid would come back to visit again. Astrid looked at Henry, waiting for permission. He nodded slowly. She smiled at Bonnie and promised she would. When Astrid left that evening, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. Henry watched her go and allowed himself to hope, just a little bit. But hope is a dangerous thing when reality has other plans. The board of directors wasn't done with Astrid. They'd hired a private investigator who'd tracked her to Henry's neighborhood. New photos surfaced online. Astrid entering a rundown building in the poor part of town. The headlines wrote themselves. Billionaire's secret slum visits. Is she trying to hide her affair? The pressure intensified. The board gave Astrid an ultimatum. And whatever this was, publicly distance herself from the scandal, or face a vote of no confidence. They could remove her as CEO if they had enough votes, and they were dangerously close to having the numbers. Her family called, her mother crying on the phone, begging her to think about the legacy her father had built. Cousins and uncles weighed in, all saying the same thing. This wasn't worth it. Some random man wasn't worth throwing away everything she'd worked for. Henry saw the new articles. He saw what was happening to Astrid because of him. He made another decision, the hardest one yet. He called her, using the hotel's main line since he'd deleted her direct number. When she answered, he told her they needed to stop seeing each other. She tried to argue, but he cut her off. He explained that Bonnie was starting to ask questions, starting to get attached. He couldn't let his daughter get hurt when this inevitably fell apart. And it would fall apart. He worked night shifts delivering flowers. She ran a billion-dollar empire. There was no future there, and pretending otherwise was just going to make the ending worse. Astrid's voice cracked when she asked if that was really what he wanted. Henry closed his eyes and lied. He said yes. The line went quiet for a long moment. Then Astrid said she understood. She thanked him for the time they'd had, brief as it was. She hung up before he could hear her cry. Henry went through the motions of living. He found a job at a grocery store, stocking shelves overnight. It paid less than the flower shop, but it was work. Bonnie asked about Astrid once, wondering when their friend was coming back. Henry told her that Astrid was very busy, that she probably wouldn't be able to visit anymore. Bonnie looked sad, but accepted it the way children do, trusting that adults know what's best, even when they clearly don't. Henry hated himself for the lie, but he told himself it was for the best. Better a small hurt now than a bigger one later. Astrid threw herself back into work, trying to bury herself in meetings and mergers. But something had fundamentally changed in her. She couldn't pretend anymore that this life was enough. She looked around the boardroom one morning, at the faces of men who'd never once asked if she was happy, who only cared about stock prices and quarterly reports. She thought about Henry in his small apartment with his beautiful daughter. She thought about the way he'd made instant coffee feel like the best thing she'd ever tasted just because he'd made it with care. She thought about Bonnie's stick figure drawing, where she'd been included in a family portrait with a child she barely knew. That little girl had seen something worth drawing, something worth including. These men in their expensive suits saw her as a problem to be managed, a liability to be controlled. The next board meeting started like all the others. The members filed in, took their seats, opened their folders. Astrid sat at the head of the table and waited for them to settle. Then she stood up. She didn't sit back down. She told them she was resigning as CEO, effective immediately. The room erupted in shocked voices, people talking over each other, demanding she reconsider. She held up a hand for silence. She explained that she'd spent 10 years building this company into what it was. She'd sacrificed relationships, personal happiness, her entire 20s, and half her 30s. She'd done it because she thought success meant something. But she'd been wrong. Success without connection was just expensive, loneliness. She'd found someone who made her want to try again, who made her believe that maybe she could have something real. And she was choosing him, choosing the possibility of love over the certainty of profit margins. The board could vote in a new CEO. She'd retain her shares but step back from operations. She was done living for their approval. One of the older board members tried to appeal to her sense of duty, reminding her of everything her father had built. Astrid smiled sadly and said her father had died alone in a hospital room because he'd been too busy working to notice the warning signs of his heart attack. She wasn't going to make the same mistake. She walked out of that meeting and got in her car. She drove straight to Bonnie's elementary school. It was midday, and the kids were at recess. Astrid stood outside the fence, watching Bonnie play on the swings with other children. She looked so happy, so completely unaware of adult complications. A teacher noticed Astrid and approached, asking if she could help. Astrid explained she was a friend of the family. The teacher looked skeptical until Henry showed up, having gotten an alert from the school about an unknown woman on the property. He stopped short when he saw her. Astrid turned to face him, and the other parents and teachers seemed to sense something significant happening. A small crowd gathered. Bonnie noticed the commotion and ran over, throwing herself at Astrid with a delighted shout. The little girl asked if she'd come to have lunch with them. Astrid said she'd come for something more important. She looked at Henry, her hands shaking slightly, and asked if they could talk. Henry's first instinct was to say no, to protect himself and his daughter from more hurt. But something in Astrid's expression stopped him. She looked different. Lighter somehow, despite the fear in her eyes. They stepped away from the crowd, Bonnie holding both their hands, swinging between them like this was all a wonderful game. Astrid told Henry what she'd done. About quitting her position. About walking away from the board and their demands. About choosing the possibility of something real over the safety of her empire. Henry stared at her in shock. He asked if she'd lost her mind. She laughed and said maybe she had. But she was tired of living in that big empty penthouse. Tired of fake smiles at charity events. Tired of being alone. She knew she was being dramatic, showing up at his daughter's school like some character in a movie. But she needed him to understand. She wasn't asking him to fit into her world anymore. She was ready to meet him halfway. To build something new that belonged to both of them. Henry felt tears burning in his eyes. He hadn't cried since his wife's funeral. But something about this moment, this impossible woman standing in front of him with dirt from the playground on her expensive shoes, offering to give up everything for a chance at them, broke something open in his chest. Bonnie looked up at both of them and asked very seriously if they were going to kiss now like in the movies. Several parents laughed. Henry and Astrid both blushed. But then Henry cupped Astrid's face in his hands and kissed her. Right there, in front of teachers and parents and curious children. The crowd applauded. Bonnie cheered. When they broke apart, Henry asked Astrid if she was sure about this. She'd worked so hard for everything she'd built. She said she'd never been more sure of anything. He asked what came next. She said she had some ideas. A charitable foundation to help single parents. Resources and support for families struggling the way Henry had struggled. And maybe, if he was interested, they could open a flower shop together. A real one, not some late-night delivery service. Somewhere people could come during daylight hours and see beautiful things. Henry laughed through his tears and said that sounded perfect. Bonnie declared she wanted to help too, that she'd be the best flower girl ever. They both corrected her gently. Not flower girl. Shop assistant. She was going to be part of this, of course she was. This was going to be their family business. The months that followed weren't perfect. Henry and Astrid had to figure out how to merge their very different lives. She sold her penthouse and bought a more modest house in a neighborhood between the rich area and the poor one. A place that felt like neutral ground. She set up the foundation and threw herself into actually helping people instead of just writing checks. Henry worked with her to find single parents who needed job training, childcare support, emergency funds. They met people whose stories were like Henry's had been, and they made sure those people didn't fall through the cracks the way the system had nearly let him fall. The flower shop opened 6 months later, a bright storefront with Bonnie's artwork in the windows. They called it Second Chances Flowers. The first week was slow, but word spread. People liked the story. They liked the idea of the billionaire who'd given it all up for love, and the single dad who'd proven that kindness still mattered. Business picked up. The media coverage was different this time. Still, intense, but warmer. People called it a fairy tale. Astrid's family eventually came around. Her mother visited the new house and met Bonnie, and it was hard to stay disapproving when faced with such an earnest, sweet child. Even a few of the old board members sent congratulations, though Astrid suspected they were just relieved she wasn't making headlines for scandals anymore. She stayed on as a shareholder but let the new CEO handle operations. It turned out she liked having free time. She liked being able to pick Bonnie up from school. She liked working alongside Henry in the flower shop, their hands brushing as they arranged bouquets. She liked going to bed at a reasonable hour and waking up to something other than stress and loneliness. The wedding was small. Just close friends and family in the garden behind their house. Bonnie served as the flower girl, a role she took incredibly seriously, dropping petals with precise concentration. Astrid wore a simple white dress, nothing like the designer gown her mother had suggested. Henry wore a suit Astrid had bought him, though he'd argued about that for hours before finally accepting. When they said their vows, they both cried. Bonnie cried too, happy tears, because her family picture had finally come true. Daddy and me and Astrid, all together now, and Mommy watching from heaven with her crown. After the ceremony, as they stood together receiving congratulations, Henry pulled Astrid close and whispered that he still couldn't quite believe this was real. She laughed and told him to get used to it. She'd quit a CEO position for him. She wasn't going anywhere. Later that night, after the guests had gone home and Bonnie was asleep upstairs, Henry and Astrid sat on their back porch steps, looking at the stars. He asked her if she ever regretted it. Giving up the company, the power, the prestige. She didn't hesitate. She said the only thing she'd ever regretted was the years she'd wasted being afraid to want something real. He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. He told her about that night at the hotel, how close he'd come to just leaving after realizing he had the wrong room. How if it had been in any other delivery, any other night, they never would have met. She rested her head on his shoulder and said she didn't believe in fate usually, but she believed in that mistake. That beautiful, perfect mistake. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of their neighborhood, feeling the warmth of the life they'd built together. The life that had started with a wrong turn, a bouquet of roses, and two people lonely enough to take a chance on something impossible. Sometimes the biggest happiness in a person's life begins with a delivery gone wrong. With flowers meant for someone else, handed to exactly the right person. with two worlds that should never have touched, colliding in a hotel hallway during a rainstorm. Henry and Astrid had learned that love didn't care about bank accounts or social status. It cared about recognition, about seeing someone truly and being seen in return, about choosing each other even when the world said you shouldn't, about building something new instead of fitting into something that never felt right in the first place. Their story became the kind of thing people talked about when they needed to believe that good things could still happen, that kindness still mattered, that sometimes, against all odds and logic, love actually won. And in their little house with the flower shop down the street and a daughter who drew them into her pictures, they lived that story every single day. Not a fairy tale. Something better. Something real.